A veteran, Thomas Cole, stood in the freezing Oregon rain, his eviction notice days from expiring. He clutched his 4-year-old granddaughter, Sydney, his last few $100s in his pocket. The auctioneer rolled up the door to Unit 113. The crowd recoiled. It was a wall of black trash bags, reeking of decay. The professionals laughed and walked away. But as the auctioneer tried to move on, Thomas saw something. A single, tiny military green detail, deep in the shadows, that no one else had noticed. He raised his hand. Why would a desperate man bid all his money on a unit full of garbage? And what secrets, hidden by a long-dead general, were waiting inside those bags? Please support us by subscribing to our channel. The rain was the enemy. In Astoria, Oregon, this was a battle Thomas Cole lost every day. The endless, weeping gray of the November sky was not just weather. It was a physical weight. It forced its way through the warped window frames of the small rental house, bringing with it the damp, fishy smell of the Columbia River and a chill that settled deep in a man's bones. For Thomas, it settled in his left leg, in the place where shrapnel from 1973 had left its permanent, angry signature. The ache started as a dull throb when he woke, and amplified by the cold floor, became a sharp, grinding pain by noon. He stood at the kitchen window, watching the rain turn the small patch of yard into a brown soup. Thomas Cole was 68 years old, a former Marine, and a widower. His reflection in the glass showed a man who looked exactly his part. Tall, with a lean frame that still held a wiry strength, but the face was deeply weathered. His brown hair, still thick, was heavily streaked with gray, especially at the temples. His face was a map of hard years and worry, but his eyes, when they were not clouded by the pain in his leg, were kind. A small sound, the dry scrape of crayon on paper, came from the kitchen table. "Is it still raining, Grandpa?" Thomas turned. His granddaughter, Sydney, sat at the small, wobbly table. She was 4 years old, small for her age, with large, watchful eyes that seemed too old for her face. She was a quiet child, sensitive and clinging, having known only her grandfather for the last year. At her feet, so still he was almost part of the shadows, lay Arrow. Arrow was an 8-year-old German shepherd, his coat a distinguished mix of gray and white. He was a large dog, calm and intelligent, rescued by Thomas years ago. Now his sole purpose seemed to be the silent, steady guardianship of the little girl. His head was resting on his paws, but his dark, almond-shaped eyes were open, fixed on Thomas. "It is, Pumpkin," Thomas said, his voice a low rumble. "But it'll stop eventually." It was a lie, and he knew it. In Astoria, in November, the rain never truly stopped. It just paused to take a breath. The real reason for the acid rising in his throat lay on the kitchen counter. It was a single envelope, made of cheap paper, but bearing a window of aggressive, clear plastic. The words, printed in stark red ink, were impossible to ignore. Final notice to pay or vacate. He had retrieved it from the mailbox this morning, his heart sinking with each step back to the house. It was from Lawson Property Management. Thomas had never met Mr. Lawson, the supporting character in his failure, but he pictured a man with a clipboard and no patience. The notice was brutally simple. He had 14 days. 14 days to find $1,500 in back rent, or they would be on the street. $1,500. He might as well have been asked for the moon. Thomas rubbed the back of his neck. He thought of the worn leather wallet in his back pocket. Inside, carefully folded, were 3 $100 bills, a 50 and a 20. $370. No, his mind corrected him, 350. The other 20 was for gas to get him through the end of the week. $350. It was the last of his meager savings, money he had been desperately scraping together for months, money earmarked for the failing brakes on his 1994 pickup truck. The truck was their only escape, their only reliable asset, and it was not even safe to drive. The shame was a cold, heavy thing in his chest. He had promised his daughter, in her final days, that he would keep Sydney safe. He had promised, and now, with winter closing in, he was failing. Arrow seemed to sense the shift in the room. The dog lifted his head, a low, almost inaudible whine building in his throat before he silenced it. He just watched. Thomas could not bear the dog's steady, knowing gaze. "I'll be back," he said, mostly to the room. He moved to the coat rack by the door. He pulled on his old brown leather flight jacket, the one he had owned for decades. The leather was cracked and worn, but it was warm. Underneath, he wore his usual uniform, a flannel shirt of faded red and dark navy blue, worn denim jeans, and heavy work boots. The boots, at least, were sturdy. Sydney looked up, her crayon pausing. "Where?" "Just for a drive. To check the tires. You stay with Arrow." "Okay." She went back to her drawing, and Arrow rested his chin back on his paws, his duty clear. Thomas stepped outside, pulling the door shut against the dampness that was already inside. The rain was cold, and his limp was worse as he crossed the slick concrete path to the truck. The old engine coughed, sputtered, and finally turned over with a groan. He backed out of the driveway, the high, sharp squeal of the brakes cutting through the sound of the rain, mocking him with the $350 he did not have. He drove without a destination, the truck's old wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. He drove past the skeletal masts of the boats in the marina, past the closed-down diners and tourist shops. He was just running, escaping the red-inked words on his kitchen counter. His gas gauge was hovering near E. He pulled into a small convenience store on the edge of the industrial district, deciding to spend the gas money now. He went inside, the fluorescent lights humming, to pay. As the clerk, a young man half asleep, ran his card, Thomas glanced at the free community newspaper rack, the Astoria Gazette. He picked one up, folding it under his arm, and walked back to his truck. He sat for a minute while the tank filled, the rhythmic clack of the pump the only sound. He opened the paper. He scanned the help-wanted ads first, a familiar ritual of disappointment. Nothing but part-time dock work that his leg could not handle, or fast food shifts that would not pay half of what he needed. He sighed, turning the page. His eyes scanned past classifieds for used furniture and lost pets. Then he saw it, a small black-bordered box ad in the bottom corner of page 8. Public auction, ABC, storage. Cash only. This Saturday. 9 a.m., units sold to the highest bidder. He read it twice. He knew the place. It was just a mile down the road. It was gambling. It was the act of a desperate, foolish man. It was throwing away money he did not have on the unknown. Thomas looked at the ad, then at the rain-lashed windshield. He thought of the $350 in his wallet. He thought of the $1,500 he owed Mr. Lawson. He thought of Sydney's small, pale face and the broken music box. No, that was later, just her face. He looked at the ad again. It was the stupidest idea he had ever had. He ripped the small ad from the paper, folded the square, and pushed it deep into the pocket of his jeans. The pump clicked off. Thomas got out of the truck, his leg aching, and drove home. The Saturday of the auction arrived with a fresh, spiteful burst of rain. The temperature had dropped, and the wind now carried a sharper edge, promising a winter that would show no mercy. Thomas had not slept. He had spent the night staring at the ceiling of his cold bedroom, the $350 in his wallet feeling like a physical weight in his pocket. It was insane. He was a fool to even consider it. But then the image of the red-inked eviction notice would flash in his mind, and he would feel the cold panic rising all over again. He could not leave Sydney alone in the house. She was 4, and the house was not safe. He could not, in good conscience, leave her in the old truck either. The cab was drafty, and the heater was unreliable. So, he had no choice. At 8:30 in the morning, Thomas Cole walked onto the wet asphalt of the ABC storage lot, an image of complete and total defeat. He carried Sydney, who had thankfully fallen back asleep, wrapped in the only good blanket they owned, an old wool army green one. The small 4-year-old body was a warm, precious weight against his chest. In his other hand, he gripped the leather leash of Arrow. Arrow, ever stoic, walked close to his left leg, his paws silent on the wet ground. The dog's gray and white coat seemed to absorb the miserable light. He did not bark or whine, but his ears swiveled, taking in the scene. They were a tragic little parade, and Thomas knew it. He found a spot at the far edge of the crowd, under the partial cover of a metal awning that ran along the main office. The rhythmic drip of water from its edge was a miserable metronome to his thoughts. He felt a profound, burning humiliation. He was a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. He had worn a uniform with honor. He had built things, fixed things, and provided for his family. Now he was standing in the rain, clutching his grandchild and his dog, waiting for a chance to fight over the discarded refuse of strangers. The other bidders were a pack. They were professionals, mostly men in heavy-duty jackets and work boots, holding thermoses of coffee and laughing with easy familiarity. They looked at Thomas, at the child in his arms and the dog at his feet, and their eyes either slid past him with disinterest or lingered with a brief, pitying curiosity. Both reactions made Thomas feel smaller. He was an outsider, a ghost, a failure. At 9 o'clock sharp, a man in a bright yellow rain slicker stepped out from the office. He was stout with a loud, commanding voice. This was Mr. Russo, the auctioneer. "All right, folks, good morning," Mr. Russo's voice boomed, cutting through the sound of the rain. "Good to see so many familiar faces and a few new ones. You know the rules. Cash only. You buy the whole unit, and you have 48 hours to clear it out. Let's make some money." He led the pack, and Thomas and Arrow trailed at the very back, like scavengers following lions. The first unit was full of decent furniture. The bidding was fast, ending at over $800. The second held stacks of tools and lawn equipment. It went for $600. Thomas just watched. These people knew what they were doing. They saw value in a glance. He, on the other hand, was just cold, his bad leg beginning to lock up. After 20 minutes, Mr. Russo led them to the back row, stopping in front of a unit with a faded green door. "All right, next up is Unit 113, Unit 113. An employee cut the lock, and the metal door rolled up with a loud metallic screech. The crowd instinctively recoiled. A smell hit them first, a thick, wet, suffocating odor of mildew, decay, and old damp clothes. Inside, from floor to ceiling, was nothing but a wall of black contractor trash bags. Some had split, revealing glimpses of stained fabric. It was not a storage unit, it was a landfill. "Ugh, a trash out," one of the bidders near Thomas muttered, in disgust. "Not worth the dump fees," another replied. The crowd, which had been pressed forward, now melted away. They were already walking toward the next unit, their interest completely gone. "All right, folks, what am I bid for 113? Mr. Russo's voice had lost its enthusiasm. He needed to get it off the books. "Let's start it at $50. $50 for the unit." Silence. The only sound was the dripping from the awning. 50? How about 25? $25 to take it all. But Thomas had not moved. He stood at the edge, the angle giving him a slightly different view. The professionals had seen trash, but Thomas, whose entire life had been about observing details, looked closer. His eyes scanned past the front wall of black bags. He saw the same mildew and decay, but deep in the back, in the far right corner, almost completely hidden, he saw something else. It was not a black bag. It was canvas, dark olive green. And on its strap, there was a knot. It was not just any knot. It was a precise, tight, secured loop. It was a military-style paracord knot, a knot Thomas had tied 1,000 times himself, a knot you used to secure gear so it would never, ever fail you. It was a knot of discipline. In a pile of chaos, here was one single point of perfect order. A shiver ran down Thomas's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Why was that here? This was not the work of someone just throwing things away. This was the work of a soldier, a veteran, someone like him. In his desperation, it felt like a sign, a message in a bottle. "Going once at 25? Mr. Russo called, exasperated. Come on, somebody take it. 25, Thomas said. His voice was hoarse, barely a croak, but it cut through the rain. Mr. Russo's head snapped toward him, his expression surprised. We got $25 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 50? Another bidder, one of the professionals, laughed. Sure, I'll go 50. He was probably bidding just to see the new guy waste his money. I have 50, Russo said. Do I hear 75? Thomas locked his eyes on the green canvas. He thought of the eviction notice. 75. 100, the other bidder called, still smiling. 125, Thomas said, his voice stronger. The smile on the other bidder's face faded. He shrugged and backed off, not willing to spend real money on a joke. $125, Mr. Russo chanted, his professional rhythm returning. Do I hear 150? 150? Silence. 175? 175, Thomas said. His heart was hammering. This was half his money. Another voice, a new one from the crowd, a woman this time. 200? $200. Russo pointed. Now we got an auction. Do I hear 225? Thomas looked at Sydney, her small face peaceful in sleep, oblivious. He looked at Arrow, who was watching him with absolute, trusting stillness. He had $350. He had 14 days. He took a breath. $217. It was a strange, specific number, the amount he had in his wallet minus what he needed for gas and a gallon of milk. It was his entire world. The woman who bid 200 hesitated, did the math, and shook her head. Mr. Russo paused, looking at Thomas. He saw the sleeping child, the big dog, and the desperation. $217, going once, going twice. He waited one more beat. Sold to the gentleman with the dog for $217. Good luck to you, sir. The crowd immediately moved on, their murmur resuming. Thomas was left alone in front of Unit 113. He leaned back against the wet brick, his bad leg trembling. He shifted Sydney's weight in his arms. She did not stir. He had just spent almost all of his money on a pile of garbage. He had $133 left to his name, and he had 48 hours to empty a tomb that smelled of failure. Thomas paid Mr. Russo the $217. The cash, damp from the rain and his own nervous hand, felt like monopoly money. He received a receipt and a yellow temporary gate code. He drove home in a daze, the squeal of his truck's failing brakes sounding like a judgment. He got Sydney inside, made her a peanut butter sandwich, and sat her at the kitchen table. He stood by the window, watching the rain, his mind blank with a silent, cold panic. He was a fool, a desperate old fool. But the purchase was made. The hole was dug. An hour later, he was back at ABC Storage, his old pickup parked in front of Unit 113. He had brought his work gloves, a heavy-duty flashlight, a new pack of utility blades for his box cutter, and the blue plastic tarp they used for picnics in a life that felt 1,000 years ago. He rolled up the heavy metal door. The sound it made was a long, painful groan of rusted metal. The smell hit him immediately, thicker and damper than it had been during the auction. It was the scent of forgotten things, of mildew, and of complete decay. Okay, he muttered to himself. He couldn't work in the dark, and he couldn't leave Sydney in the truck. He unfolded the large blue tarp and spread it on the concrete floor just inside the unit in the square of gray light from the opening. He walked back to the truck. All right, Pumpkin, we're going to be here for a while. He unbuckled Sydney from her car seat. She was clutching a small, worn-out stuffed rabbit. He set her down on the center of the tarp. You're the queen of the blue square, understand? You and Arrow have to stay right here. Sydney nodded, her eyes wide as she looked at the mountain of black bags. It's spooky, Grandpa. It's just stuff, honey. Arrow hopped out of the truck cab and immediately took his post. He walked the perimeter of the blue tarp, sniffed the air, and then lay down at the edge, his body forming a living barrier between Sydney and the dark interior. His head was up, his ears alert, his gaze fixed on the shadows. He was on guard. Thomas pulled on his gloves. "Here we go." He grabbed the nearest bag. It was heavy, and the plastic was slick with a cold, damp film. He ripped it open. A burst of truly foul air exploded out, making him gag. It was rotted food, packaging, and a mass of soaked paper, completely unidentifiable. He felt the 217th ache in his gut. He hauled the heavy bag out and threw it into the bed of his truck, his bad leg screaming at the awkward, heavy lift. The second bag. He cut it open. More of the same. Soaked clothes, but not the kind he had hoped for. These were stained, torn, and covered in a gray-green mold. A single rotted tennis shoe fell out. The third bag was just wet cardboard and newspapers, heavy as lead. Thomas stopped, breathing hard. He leaned against the cold, corrugated metal wall, his hand over his mouth. The humiliation from the morning was gone, replaced by a hollow, sickening despair. He had done it. He had thrown away their last bit of money. He had failed Sydney. He had failed the memory of his daughter. "What?" he whispered to the shadows. "What have I done?" Sydney was humming to herself, a small, tuneless sound, as she drew on a scrap of paper he'd brought. Arrow, seeing his master's distress, stood up. The big dog did not whine. He did not bark. He simply walked past Thomas, his claws making a soft clicking sound on the concrete, and moved deeper into the unit. He navigated the piles of trash with a confident step, his nose testing the air. Thomas watched him. "Arrow, get back here." Arrow ignored him. He walked straight to the back right corner, to the one thing Thomas had noticed during the auction. He stopped in front of the olive green canvas duffel bag, the one with the paracord knot. The dog lowered his head and sniffed the bag from top to bottom. Then he looked back at Thomas and pushed the heavy bag with his nose. A low, soft woof of air came from his nostrils. It was not a bark, but it was an order. "What is it, boy?" Thomas said, his voice hoarse. Thomas climbed over the piles of trash bags, his leg throbbing. He reached the duffel. It was heavy, but a dry, solid heavy. He ran his hand over the canvas. It was damp on the outside, but the material was thick. He grabbed the knot. It was just as he'd seen, perfect, tight, and impossible to undo by hand. He pulled out his box cutter. Okay. He carefully sliced the canvas itself, not the knot. He pulled the bag open. The smell was not mildew. It was the sharp, chemical, and clean scent of mothballs, a scent that spoke of preservation, not decay. He reached inside and his gloves touched plastic. He pulled out a large bundle, wrapped in thick, industrial-grade nylon. He ripped the plastic open. Inside was silk. He pulled it out, his rough, gloved hands fumbling. It was a dress, black and heavy, and it unfolded perfectly. It was pristine. He had no idea about fashion, but he knew quality. This was quality. He reached in again. A cream-colored cashmere coat, so soft it looked like liquid in the dim light. He laid it gently on the floor, away from the trash. A third time. His hand closed on hard leather. He pulled out a dark brown handbag, heavy with gold hardware that did not have a speck of rust. He pulled out another bag, and another, and a silk blouse, and a pair of leather pants. They were all immaculate. He was standing in a tomb of garbage, holding a king's ransom. "I don't understand," he whispered. He was in shock, just staring at the pile of impossible luxury. He heard a small scuffling sound. Sydney had crawled off the tarp, her curiosity winning over her grandfather's orders. Arrow, seeing that Thomas was no longer in distress, had allowed it. "Sydney, no, honey, stay on the blue," he called out, his voice distant. But she had already reached the duffel bag. Her small, chubby hand dove into the opening, right past a silk dress, and grabbed something he had not seen. She crawled back to her tarp, holding her prize. It was a small porcelain object. She sat down, turned it over in her hands, and a rare, pure smile of absolute delight lit up her face. "Grandpa, look, a dolly?" Thomas walked over, his knees weak. It was a porcelain music box. The figure on top was a ballerina, her arms raised in a delicate pose, her tiny painted dress a pale blue. "It's beautiful, Pumpkin," he said, his voice thick. Sydney, who had almost no toys of her own, hugged it to her chest. "Mine," she whispered, a word of profound possession. "Here," Thomas said, his heart aching with a strange new emotion. "Let's see if it plays music." He knelt beside her, his bad leg protesting. He took the small cold object. It was heavier than it looked. He found the small metal key on the bottom and gently turned it. It resisted, then gave. A mechanical clicking sound came from the tiny mechanism. Click, click, whir. Thomas held his breath, waiting for the melody. The mechanism gave one final sharp click and then a dull thud. Then silence. He turned the key again. The same result. A sharp metallic sound, a whir of springs, and then nothing. The ballerina did not spin. No music came. It was broken. He looked at the priceless clothes and bags piled on the floor. He looked at the one delicate, broken thing his granddaughter had chosen. A wave of indescribable sadness washed over him. It was a beautiful promise, but it was shattered. Sydney's smile faded, her face clouding with a familiar adult disappointment. "It's okay, Grandpa," she whispered, sensing his sadness. She took the music box back from him. She held the broken, silent ballerina and hugged it tightly to her chest anyway. Thomas stared at the wall of black bags, his task not even halfway done. He was no longer desperate. He was no longer terrified. He was something else. He was a man holding a story that wasn't his, a tragedy he didn't understand, and a broken music box that felt more valuable than all the silk in the room. The discovery of the clothes had changed the air. The heavy, cold blanket of despair that had settled on Thomas in the unit had lifted, replaced by a sharp electric thrum of possibility. The $27 was no longer a mistake. It was a mystery. He took a moment to reset. He carefully folded the cashmere coat and the silk dresses, placing them on a clean, dry corner of the tarp, well away from the remaining grime. Sydney, still clutching her broken ballerina, watched him with large, curious eyes. "See, Pumpkin?" Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's not all trash. It's like a treasure hunt." He turned back to the dense pile, his bad leg aching but his mind newly focused. He was no longer a scavenger. He was an archaeologist. He began to work with a system, sorting the bags into 3 piles, the clear, wet trash for the truck bed, the duffel bags of clothing, and a new, growing pile of unknowns. He was halfway through a moldy stack of contractor bags when his boot hit something solid. It was not the soft give of wet cardboard or packed clothes. It was hard, and it was heavy. He dragged the surrounding bags away, his heart beating a new, heavy rhythm. Underneath, covered in dust and grime, was a small, wooden footlocker. It was military issue, or at least styled to be. Dark olive green, with faded stenciling on the side that was no longer legible, and heavy brass latches, greened with age. Thomas's breath caught. He knew this box. He had been issued a box just like it, a lifetime ago. "Arrow, watch Sydney," he commanded, though the dog had not moved from his post. He knelt, his bad knee protesting on the cold concrete. The brass latches were stiff, sealed by time and damp. He had to use the small pry bar from his truck's toolbox to get the first one to release. It gave way with a sharp metallic pop. The second was just as stubborn, but it finally sprang open. He lifted the heavy lid. A new smell emerged, entirely different from the mildew or the mothballs. This was the scent of old wool, cedar, and polished brass. It was the smell of history, of discipline. His eyes, accustomed to the dim light, adjusted. The first thing he saw, folded perfectly on top, was a military dress uniform. It was not the Marine Corps green he knew, but the deep formal blue of the Army. The fabric was pristine. He lifted it gently. It was heavy, the wool perfectly preserved. He looked at the rank insignia on the shoulders. He squinted. They were stars, not one, but... He counted them. 4. Thomas's hand, the one in the worn leather glove, trembled. This was the uniform of a 4-star general. He laid the jacket aside with a reverence he did not know he possessed. Underneath were several flat, velvet boxes. He picked up the smallest one first. It was dark blue. He opened it. On the satin lining lay a medal with a purple ribbon. The Purple Heart. Thomas, the Marine, instinctively straightened his back. He touched the medal's cold metal edge with his fingertip. A sudden, sharp anger surged through him, hot and quick. Whatever the story, whoever this man was, this did not belong here. This did not belong in a place of rot. He opened the next box, a larger one. His eyes widened. The Silver Star. He sat back on his heels, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. This was not just a uniform, this was a man's life, his honor, his sacrifice. This was a hero, and his legacy was sitting in a dump, bought for $217 by a failed old man. "Who were you?" he whispered to the cold, damp air. He needed a name. He set the medals and uniform carefully on the tarp. He turned back to the bags, now digging with a frantic, respectful energy. He found another duffel, lighter than the first. He tore it open. It was not clothes this time. It was paper, photo albums, the old kind with thick black paper and brittle, yellowing cellophane covers. He pulled one out and opened it on his knee. The first photos were in black and white from the 1950s or 1960s. An impossibly young, handsome man in a crisp uniform, his arm around a beautiful woman with a bright, joyful smile. It was their wedding. He turned the pages, a life unfolding in silent squares. The man at Fort Benning, the man in a jungle that looked hauntingly familiar to Thomas, the man standing next to a jeep, looking tired but resolute, the woman holding a baby, then 2 children. He picked up another album. The photos were in color now, the 1980s or 1990s. The man was older, his hair gray, but his posture was ramrod straight. The uniform had changed, the ribbons on his chest multiplying, the stars on his shoulders growing in number. He was standing with the same woman, her hair now a stylish silver, both of them beaming. On the bottom of one photo, in neat white cursive, was a caption, "Harrison and me, Governor's Ball, 1998. Harrison." Thomas dug in the bag again. A framed certificate had slipped to the bottom. He wiped the grime off the glass. It was a letter of commendation addressed to General Harrison Grant. Thomas let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 20 years. General Harrison Grant. The name echoed in his memory, a name from old news broadcasts, a name associated with honor and a kind of old-world integrity. General Grant, Thomas said aloud, the name feeling heavy in his mouth. He looked at the moldy trash bags that surrounded him. This made no sense. This was a man who would be buried with full honors at Arlington. Why was his life, his very soul, hidden in a trash bag camouflaged tomb in Astoria, Oregon? He felt a deep, profound sadness. He carefully placed the albums on the safe pile. He had to keep going. He had to clear the unit. He worked for another hour, moving the last of the garbage bags. Most were, in fact, just garbage. The camouflage had been thorough. Finally, only a few stray items were left scattered on the floor. A broken lamp, a rusted bucket, and a single old combat boot. He sighed, his body screaming in protest. His leg was on fire. He picked up the boot to toss it into the truck bed with the other trash. It was heavy. Impossibly, ridiculously heavy, for one boot. His first thought was that it was filled with water or dirt. But it felt solid. He held it up, puzzled. He shook it. A muffled, heavy clinking sound came from within. He turned the boot upside down over the concrete floor and gave it a hard, sharp shake. A cascade of items tumbled out, landing with a clatter and a soft thud on the dusty floor. First, 3 watches. They were not modern digital toys. They were classic, elegant timepieces, the kind he had only seen in jewelers' windows. One was gold, or looked like it, with a dark leather band. The other 2 were silver, their faces complex and beautiful even under a layer of dust. Then, landing with a soft, heavy sound, came a small, dark velvet pouch, tied shut with a silk drawstring. Thomas's heart, which had been pounding with a mix of anger and respect, now began to hammer with a different, more complicated rhythm. This was not honor. This was money. He knelt, his joints cracking. He fumbled with the drawstring, his thick gloves making him clumsy. He ripped the glove off his right hand and worked the knot open with his bare, shaking fingers. He tipped the contents of the pouch into his raw, calloused palm. Even in the dim gray light of the storage unit, they flashed. A pair of earrings, each with a diamond that seemed to draw all the light in the room. A delicate platinum or white gold necklace, from which hung a single, brilliant blue stone, and a ring, a simple gold band set with a cluster of bright, clear diamonds. Thomas stared, unable to breathe. This was not costume jewelry. This was real. This was worth... He could not even begin to guess. This was worth more than his rent. This was worth more than the truck, more than the house he was being thrown out of. This was a fortune. He carefully, quickly, scooped the jewelry back into the pouch and pulled the string tight. He shoved the pouch deep into the pocket of his jeans, where it sat next to the ripped-out ad for the auction. He grabbed the watches and put them in his other pocket. He sat down heavily on the edge of the blue tarp, his body suddenly spent. He looked at Sydney. She was humming to her broken ballerina, lost in her own small, safe world. He looked at Arrow, whose steady, dark eyes had not left his face. He had a hero's medals in one pile and a fortune in his pocket. The $1,500 he needed to save them from the street suddenly seemed like a joke, replaced by a problem so large he could not see the edges of it. "What am I supposed to do now, boy?" he whispered to Arrow. The big dog moved, crawling the few feet across the tarp, and laid his heavy head on his master's bad knee. It was the only answer he had. Thomas sat on the cold edge of the tarp, the velvet pouch heavy in his pocket. The adrenaline from finding the jewelry had vanished, leaving behind a cold, hollow echo. He felt exhaustion seep into his bones, a weariness so profound it was almost a sickness. His leg was a solid, burning column of pain. He had a fortune in one pocket, a hero's medals in a pile, and a crying, unfixable need for $1,500. He had no idea what to do. The conflicting discoveries, the honor and the wealth, the trash and the treasure, left him feeling dizzy, as if the ground itself was unstable. "Grandpa," Sydney's small voice cut through his fog. "Are we done?" He looked at her small face, her cheeks pink from the cold. She was still clutching the broken ballerina. "Not yet, Pumpkin. Almost. We have to clean up." He couldn't just leave. He had 48 hours, and he had made a promise. He had to empty the unit. With a groan that came from his very soul, Thomas pushed himself to his feet. The first task was to separate the treasure from the trash. He found the other empty duffel bag, the one with the perfect military knot, and began to carefully, almost reverently, pack the items he was saving. The general's dress uniform, the boxes of medals, the photo albums which he wrapped in a piece of clean plastic. He put the high-end clothing from the first duffel into this one as well, creating a single, protected collection. The rest of the work was just manual labor. For the next hour, he became a machine. He hauled the remaining black bags, the ones that were truly, unequivocally garbage, and threw them into the bed of his truck. He swept the floor. The unit was slowly transforming from a tomb to just an empty metal box. Sydney, bored but patient, had fallen asleep on the tarp, her head pillowed on Arrow's flank. Arrow had not moved, a warm, living anchor for her in the cold room. But as Thomas worked, he began to notice a break in the dog's stillness. About 30 minutes in, Arrow had lifted his head. He looked at Thomas, then at Sydney, and then, as if sensing they were both safe, he stood up. He walked quietly to the back left corner of the unit. He pressed his nose against the wall and sniffed, a long, slow inhalation. "Arrow, what is it? Get back here," Thomas called, his voice tired. Arrow looked at him, then obediently walked back to the tarp and lay down beside Sydney. 10 minutes later, he was back. He returned to the exact same spot. This time, he was more insistent. His nose was pressed to a seam in the wall, and a low, quiet sound, a rumble of a whine, vibrated in his deep chest. "Is it a rat, boy?" Thomas muttered, pausing as he tied off a garbage bag. "Leave it. We've got enough to deal with." But Arrow did not leave. He stayed, his body growing tense. Now, an hour after Thomas had found the jewelry, the unit was nearly empty. All that remained was the blue tarp with the sleeping child, the single precious duffel bag of treasures, and a few scraps of wood and debris. Thomas was preparing to load the duffel when he realized Arrow was no longer on the tarp. He was back in the corner. This time his behavior was different. It was not just curiosity. It was work. A soft, rhythmic scraping sound echoed in the empty unit. Thomas turned. Arrow was standing on his hind legs, his front paws braced against the wall. He was gently scratching at a specific spot, a 3-foot square section of cheap gray painted plywood. It was a patch covering the corrugated metal of the unit's back wall. It was an ugly, clumsy fix, something Thomas had barely registered. Arrow dropped to all fours, then sniffed the bottom edge of the panel, his nose working obsessively. He was not agitated, the way he would be with a raccoon or a rat. This was a deep, focused investigation. He was smelling something that Thomas couldn't. Old air, perhaps. Trapped dust, or maybe, like the duffel bag, he was smelling history. He was smelling leather. "Arrow," Thomas said, his voice quiet. The dog stopped, looked at him, and then scratched the panel once more, a single, deliberate gesture. Thomas put down the garbage bag. He walked over to the corner, his boots loud on the concrete. He remembered. He remembered Arrow nudging the canvas duffel. He remembered the dog's stillness, his patience. Arrow was not a frivolous animal. He did not waste energy. "What did you find?" Thomas whispered, kneeling by the dog. He ran his gloved hand over the plywood. It was cold. It was nailed directly to the metal studs of the unit. He pressed on it. It was solid, but why was it there? Why patch a metal wall with wood? He looked at the bottom where Arrow had been sniffing. The wood was slightly warped from years of damp, creating a tiny gap. "You're right, boy. That's odd." He trusted the dog. He had gambled on his own instinct with the knot. Now he would gamble on his dog's. Thomas walked back to his truck. He rummaged in his old metal toolbox, past the wrenches and the hammer. He pulled out the long red crowbar. It was heavy and cold in his hand. He returned to the corner. "Okay, Arrow, stand back." The dog moved aside but did not leave, sitting on his haunches, his eyes fixed on the wall. Thomas wedged the flat, sharp tip of the crowbar into the warped gap at the bottom of the panel. He put his shoulder into it, leveraging his weight against the wall. His bad leg screamed in protest, but he ignored it. The wood made a protesting groan, a sound of old fibers tearing. He pushed harder. The sharp, metallic shriek of old nails being ripped from the studs filled the air. It was a terrible, violent sound. Sydney stirred on the tarp, her eyes fluttering open. "Grandpa?" "It's okay, Pumpkin. Just making noise. Go back to sleep." He gave one final, desperate heave. The plywood panel popped free from the wall and clattered to the floor, landing with a loud, flat sound that raised a cloud of gray dust and debris. Thomas coughed, waving the air in front of his face. Arrow was already there, pushing past Thomas's legs, shoving his nose into the new darkness. Thomas fumbled for the flashlight he had set on the floor. He clicked it on, the bright yellow beam cutting through the dust. Behind where the panel had been was a small, dark, hidden recess. It was a perfect man-made square cut between two of the unit's metal support studs. It was a secret pocket, a void in the wall, and inside, sitting on a small, dusty crossbrace, was a bag. It was not a canvas duffel. It was an old military leather satchel. It was dark, almost black, the leather stiff and cracked with age. A single, heavy brass buckle, green with verdigris, held the front flap closed. It was the kind of bag an officer would carry, a bag for maps or orders or secrets. Thomas's hand was shaking so badly he could barely hold the flashlight steady. The clothes had been hidden by mothballs. The jewelry had been hidden in a boot. But this had been hidden behind a wall. This was the one thing the general had not wanted anyone ever to find by accident. He reached into the cold, dark hole. His fingers brushed the stiff leather. It was cold as ice. He gripped it, his breath held tight in his chest, and pulled it free. It was heavy, denser than it looked. He stood there for a long moment, the satchel in one hand, the flashlight in the other. He looked at Arrow. "You did this," he whispered, his voice full of awe. "You found this?" Arrow simply looked back at him, his tail giving one slow, single wag. He then walked back to the tarp, nudged Sidney's sleeping hand with his nose, and lay back down, his watch resumed. Thomas sank down onto the dusty floor, his back against the cold wall. He looked at the satchel on his knees. The auction, the clothes, the jewelry. All of it felt like a prelude. The real story was here, in his hands, locked away by a brass buckle. The drive home was silent. The short distance from ABC Storage back to the damp rental house on the edge of town felt like crossing a continent. Thomas had carefully placed the precious olive green duffel bag inside the truck's cab, shielding it from the rain. The trash bags, full of mold and true garbage, he had left in the storage unit, the door now secured with his own new, heavy padlock. He would deal with the dump tomorrow. But the leather satchel was different. It sat on the passenger seat beside him like a silent passenger, a heavy, secret-filled presence. The velvet pouch of jewelry and the vintage watches were in the deep pocket of his jacket, a tangible weight against his ribs. He carried a sleeping Sidney into the house, Arrow trotting at his heels. The house, when he stepped inside, felt different. It was colder, shabbier, and smaller. The reality of his own poverty seemed sharper, more insulting, now that he was harboring the secrets of a general. He went through the motions of their evening ritual, his mind 1,000 miles away. He heated up canned soup and made grilled cheese sandwiches on the rusty stove. Sidney ate quietly at the table, her broken ballerina music box standing beside her plate like a guest. Thomas just stared at the wall, his own soup growing cold. He gave her a bath in the old clawfoot tub, the water a pale yellow from the aging pipes. He helped her into her pajamas. "Were you sad at the treasure place, Grandpa?" she asked, her small voice cutting through his fog. He paused, his hands still on her shoulders. "What do you mean, Pumpkin?" "You were very, very quiet." "Just thinking, honey. It was a big day." He tucked her into her small cot, which was set up in the corner of his own bedroom. She was asleep in minutes, her small hand wrapped around the porcelain ballerina. Thomas waited. He waited an hour, sitting in his worn armchair, listening to the house settle. The only sounds were the persistent driving rain against the glass and the low hum of the old refrigerator. Finally, he was sure she was deeply asleep. Arrow, who had been lying by the cot, seemed to sense the shift. He stood, stretched, and walked silently into the kitchen, lying down by the back door, his gaze fixed on Thomas. He was on watch. Thomas retrieved the leather satchel from where he had hidden it under his bed. He placed it on the wobbly kitchen table, under the single, flickering overhead light. It was older than he first thought. The leather was stiff, the color faded from a rich brown to a cracked, dusty black. The brass buckle was green with corrosion. It was not a bag meant for display. It was a bag meant for work. His fingers, thick and calloused from a life of labor, fumbled with the buckle. The stiff leather strap resisted, fighting him as if protecting its contents. He had to use the pliers from his toolbox to grip the metal tab and pull it free. The strap finally came loose with a dry, ripping sound, like old parchment tearing. He lifted the heavy flap. The smell that rose from the bag was not of mildew or mold. It was the dry, clean scent of old paper, of ink, and of faint, cold metal. He reached inside. His fingers brushed against something hard and leather-bound. He pulled it out. It was a journal, thick and heavy, bound in dark green leather. The cover was plain, with only a simple, embossed border. There was no name. Beneath it was a small, black, rectangular object. He pulled it out. It was a micro-cassette recorder, a model from the 1980s or 1990s, with tiny, precise buttons for play, rewind, and record. Finally, at the bottom of the satchel was a clear plastic case designed to hold a dozen microcassettes. All 12 slots were full. Each tape was neatly labeled, not with a subject, but with a date, written in a sharp, elegant, military-style hand. Thomas sat there, his heart pounding a slow, heavy beat against his ribs. The journal or the tapes? The written word or the spoken one? He looked at the recorder. It was the more active choice. It was the voice. He checked the recorder. The battery compartment was empty. He rummaged through a kitchen drawer, the one he called the everything drawer, and found 2 AA batteries. He snapped them into place. He picked a tape from the plastic box. He chose the one with the most recent date. His large fingers struggled with the tiny, delicate cassette. He fumbled with the recorder's small door, which opened with a soft plastic click. He slotted the tape in and pushed the door shut. He sat back. He was about to cross a line. This was not his. This was a man's private life. He felt a sudden sharp pang of guilt. He was an intruder. He looked at Arrow. The dog was still watching, his head cocked, his dark eyes reflecting the single dim light. Thomas needed to know. He needed to understand the metals in the trash, the diamonds in the boot, and the knot on the duffel. He owed it to the man who tied that knot. He pressed the small button labeled play. At first, there was only a low electric hiss that seemed to amplify the silence of the kitchen. A sound of empty air, of time passing. He thought for a moment that it was broken, like the music box. Then a voice. It emerged from the tiny, tinny speaker, a sound so thin and dry it barely registered. It was a man's voice, but it had no power. It was like dry leaves skittering on pavement, punctuated by a shallow, wet cough. Testing. I don't know if this is still working. It's October 14th. The rain is back. It's always raining. Thomas instinctively leaned closer, his entire body rigid. The house is so empty since Martha passed, the voice whispered. The general's voice. Thomas knew it was him. Just the sound of the clock and the quiet. I never minded the quiet before. The voice paused, and Thomas heard a shaky breath. Julian came by today, my son. He didn't come for a visit. He came with his briefcase. He brought papers, always papers. The voice, though weak, gained a sudden, sharp edge of iron-gray anger. He calls it estate planning. He says I'm confused. That's the word he uses, confused, because I couldn't find my keys yesterday. He sat there, in my study, and explained to me how my assets needed management. Another ragged cough. He thinks my mind is going. He and Caroline, they look at my things. They don't see my life. They don't see the desk the president gave me. They see inventory. They see an auction price. Thomas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Caroline called, the general continued, his voice thick with a profound, weary sadness. My daughter, she cried on the phone, said she was so worried about me, all alone in this big house, and then she asked about her mother's silver, asked if I'd had it appraised recently, because she was just curious. The voice broke just for a second. They're trying to have me declared incompetent. My own children. Julian, the lawyer, he has the tools. He knows the words. He's building a case against me. He thinks I don't hear him on the phone in the hallway, talking to his sister, telling her to document everything. He wants to protect my assets, the general whispered, the words laced with a bitter, terrible irony. He wants to protect them from me. They want the money. They want it all. And I am just an old man, an old, confused man in their way. A sharp, mechanical sound as the tape reached its end and the auto-stop engaged, plunging the kitchen back into silence. Thomas did not move. He sat perfectly still, his hands flat on the table. The rain against the window was the only sound. He was no longer a treasure hunter. He was no longer a gambler who had gotten lucky. He was a witness. He understood the trash bags. He understood the mildew and the rot piled high to hide the things that mattered. It was not camouflage against thieves. It was camouflage against his own blood. He looked at the dark, silent journal on the table. He was almost afraid to open it. Arrow stood up, walked slowly across the linoleum, and pressed his heavy head against his master's bad knee. It was a simple, grounding pressure, a reminder that he was not alone in the room. Thomas put his hand on the dog's head, his fingers gripping the thick fur. He felt a sudden, powerful kinship with the dead general. A soldier betrayed not by an enemy, but by the very people he was meant to protect. Thomas sat in the flickering kitchen light for a long time. The only sounds were the hiss of the rain outside and the slow, heavy beat of his own heart. The general's voice, thin and full of a terrible, quiet pain, echoed in the small, shabby room. He felt a profound, cold anger. This was not just a family squabble. It was a betrayal. It was the desecration of a life, orchestrated by the very people who should have been its guardians. He, Thomas Cole, a stranger, felt a deeper connection to the general's honor than his own son and daughter. Arrow rested his heavy head on Thomas's bad knee, and the simple, warm pressure was the only thing keeping him grounded. Finally, he turned his attention to the leather-bound journal. He opened it. The first pages were written in a strong, elegant script, a leader's handwriting. They were notes on his wife, Martha's, garden, observations on the changing seasons in Astoria. But as he turned the pages, the entries grew shorter, the writing shakier, more urgent. Then he found the entry that corresponded with the tapes. They think I am a fool. They think the stroke took my mind with it. Julian moves through this house like a tax collector, his eyes inventorying everything. Caroline cries, but her tears are for the inheritance, not for me. Thomas skipped ahead, his fingers turning the brittle pages. He found what he was looking for, an entry dated only a few weeks before the general's presumed death. The camouflage is in place. I have moved the last of it. My life, packed away in trash bags. A fitting end. Let them sort through the filth. They will never find what matters. They will see only the rot and turn away, just as they turned away from me. They will not get the medals. They will not get Martha's dresses. They will not get her jewelry. Then, a final chilling paragraph. I have kept 2 items separate, my final reserves. A small silver box, a gift from the First Lady, a reminder of a life of service. And a cash reserve for a final honorable escape, should I need it. I have hidden them with the only soldier I have left, the only one who will not betray me. They are inside the tin soldier. He will stand guard. I hope, perhaps in vain, that a man of honor finds this. He will know what to do. A man of honor. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. The general was speaking to him. Thomas did not sleep. He sat in the chair until the first, watery gray light of dawn crept through the kitchen window. He made coffee with a shaking hand. He was no longer a man in despair. He was a man with a mission. He bundled a still sleeping Sydney into the truck, Arrow hopping into the cab beside her. He drove back to ABC storage. He didn't even feel the cold. He unlocked his padlock, and the metal door rolled up with its familiar groan. He had left the unit nearly empty, save for the large pile of true garbage bags he'd set aside for the dump. He scanned the concrete floor. No statue. He looked at the trash pile. He had been so focused on hauling the bags, he had barely looked at the other debris. He began pulling the bags away, one by one. And there it was. Lying on its side, half buried under a split bag of rotted newspapers, was a statue. Thomas pulled it free and stood it upright. It was, as the journal said, a tin soldier. It was about 2 feet tall, a classic nutcracker-style figure, painted in a bright red coat, blue pants, and a tall black hat. Its face was painted with a cheerful, stoic expression. It was just a statue, a piece of Christmas decoration, perhaps. He tapped it. It was hollow but solid. He shook it. Nothing rattled. He looked all over it, running his hands over the painted metal. There was no keyhole, no obvious seam. He felt a sudden, crushing doubt. Had the general been delusional? Had he, Thomas, followed a fool's errand? Arrow, who had been sitting patiently by the door, stood up. He walked over to where Thomas was kneeling. The big dog did not look at Thomas. He looked at the statue. He sniffed the base, his nose wrinkling. He walked around it, sniffing. Then he stopped. He nudged the wide circular base of the statue with his nose. A gentle but insistent push. "What is it, boy?" Thomas whispered. Arrow nudged it again in the same spot, then looked up at Thomas. Thomas leaned in, his face close to the painted metal. He saw nothing. He was about to give up, but he trusted Arrow. He trusted the dog who had found the satchel. He ran his fingertips over the spot Arrow had nudged. It was a painted seam just like the others. But was this one different? He pushed on it, right on the painted gold trim. A faint metallic click, no louder than a cricket, echoed in the unit. A small 4-inch section of the base popped open, revealing a tiny dark hollow. It was a latch. Thomas's heart leaped into his throat. He worked his fingers into the gap and pulled. The entire top of the circular base was a lid, and it lifted off with a scrape of dry metal. He peered inside the hollow statue. It was packed full. On the very top, nestled in a bed of dry, yellowed cotton, was a small, tarnished silver box about the size of his hand. He lifted it out. It was heavy, and an intricate eagle was embossed on the lid. The First Lady's memento. He set it carefully aside. Underneath was the money. It was packed in tight, paper-wrapped bundles. They were old $100 bills, the kind with the smaller faces. He pulled the bundles out, one after another, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold them. 1, 2, 3, 10, 20. There were 40 bundles, each, he guessed, holding $1,000. $40,000. Thomas stared at the pile of cash on the dusty concrete floor. It was an impossible sum. It was not a treasure. It was a bomb. He sat there, stunned, for a long time. Finally, he repacked the cash, put the silver box on top, and sealed the tin soldier. He carried it, the heavy duffel, and the jewelry back to the truck. He drove home in a complete, terrified silence, the $40,000 sitting on the floor of the cab, radiating a dangerous, corrupting heat. He got Sydney inside, set her up with her crayons. He looked at the clock. It was 10 a.m. The rental office opened at 9 base Mog. He made a decision. It was an act of pure, desperate survival. He took 15 of the $100 bills and shoved them into his pocket. He left the rest of the money in the truck, hidden under the seat, with Arrow sitting in the cab, on guard. He walked the 6 blocks to Lawson Property Management. He felt lightheaded, his bad leg dragging. He walked into the small, fluorescent-lit office. A tired-looking man in a cheap suit and a coffee-stained tie sat behind the desk. This was Mr. Lawson, the man who held their future. "Can I help you?" Mr. Lawson asked, his voice bored. "I'm Thomas Cole, from 214 River Street. You sent me a notice." Mr. Lawson's eyes narrowed. "That's right. You've got, let's see, 4 days." "I have the rent," Thomas said. His voice was a croak. He pulled the 15 bills from his pocket and laid them on the counter. The cash looked wrong, too old, too much. Mr. Lawson stared at the money. He looked up at Thomas. $1,500 in cash. It was a loan, Thomas lied, the word feeling like ash in his mouth. From an old Marine buddy. He paid me back. Mr. Lawson shrugged, his interest already gone. He was not paid to ask questions. He took the money, ran it through a counting machine, and with a loud mechanical thud, he stamped Thomas's receipt. Paid in full? Thomas walked out of the office. He was safe. The eviction was stopped. He had saved his granddaughter. He should have felt joy. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt sick. He got back to the house and carried the rest of the money, the $38,500, inside. He walked into his bedroom. He looked at the cash, this dead man's secret. He could not put it in a bank. He could not spend it. It was not his. But he had already used $1,500 of it. He was already a thief. He lifted the edge of his old, thin mattress. He shoved the paper-wrapped bundles into the darkness between the mattress and the box spring. He dropped the mattress. A puff of dust rose. He stood there in his cold, safe-for-now house and felt the weight of the money under his bed. It was not a salvation. It was a burden. It was the general's last secret, and now it was his. He, Thomas Cole, a man who had nothing, was now a man of honor, sleeping on a bed of lies. The first night after paying the rent, Thomas did not sleep. He lay on his lumpy mattress, his body exhausted, but his mind painfully, frantically awake. The immediate, gnawing terror of eviction was gone, but it had been replaced by something heavier and more complex. Beneath the thin mattress, the $3,500 felt like a physical presence, a dense, cold lump of metal under his back. He had saved them. He had used a dead man's emergency funds to stop the bleeding. But the act, which had felt like survival in the moment, now felt like theft. He was a Marine. Marines had a code. You didn't steal, and you certainly didn't steal from a fellow soldier, even a dead one. The $1,500 he had given to Mr. Lawson was a loan, he told himself, a debt of honor he had to repay. He would not, could not, touch another dollar of that money. It was not his. It was part of the general's last will, a desperate message he had intercepted. He rose before the sun, his bad legs stiff from the cold and the tension. The rain had finally paused, leaving the world in a silent, dripping, gray-blue light. Sydney was a small, warm lump in her cot, her breathing soft and even. Arrow lifted his head from his paws, his tail thumping once on the floor, and his eyes, as always, asked a simple question. What is the mission? For the first time in a year, Thomas had an answer. We have to work, boy, Thomas whispered. He went to the kitchen and made a pot of thick black coffee. He sat at the wobbly table, the leather satchel, and the general's journal in front of him. He was the guardian of this story. The general had hidden his honor, the medals, the journal, the silver memento, and he had hidden his wealth. Thomas decided, with the rigid certainty of a soldier drawing a battle line, that the two must remain separate. The honor was not for sale. The medals, the journal, the tapes, the silver box, those were the general's legacy. He would protect them. But the money? The $3,500. That was a burden. He would find a way to return it. He would, somehow, earn back the $1,500 he had borrowed and make the stash whole again. But how? His eyes drifted to the corner of the living room where the olive-green duffel bag sat. It was filled with the other discovery, the cashmere coats, the silk dresses, the heavy leather handbags. That was different. That was not a secret stash. That was just stuff. High-end, valuable stuff, but it was commercial. It was not the general's soul. It was his wife's closet. This, Thomas realized, was the honorable path. This was not a treasure he had found. It was inventory he had bought. He would not be a thief, sleeping on a bed of secret money. He would be a businessman. He would sell these items, and he would live on the proceeds. He would earn his own way. The decision settled him. It was a mission, and a Marine, even a 68-year-old one with a bad leg, knew how to execute a mission. The problem was, he had no idea how. He found his daughter's old laptop, a relic from her college days over a decade ago. It was heavy, pale gray, and took nearly 10 minutes to boot up, the sound of the hard drive a low, electric hum of complaint. He connected it to the house's slow, unreliable internet. He sat at the kitchen table, his large, calloused fingers looking comically oversized on the small plastic keys. He typed, "How to sell old clothes online." The screen filled with a language he did not understand. eBay, Poshmark, Etsy, listing fees, seller ratings, shipping calculator, SKU. He felt like he was trying to decode enemy transmissions. He was a man who could field strip a rifle in total darkness, who had navigated by the stars in a jungle, and he was completely, hopelessly defeated by a website. "Grandpa," he looked up. Sydney was standing by his chair, her broken ballerina in her hand. "Are you mad?" "No, Pumpkin, not mad. Just learning." He took a deep breath. "For Sydney," he muttered to himself, like a mantra. He spent the entire day learning. He read forums. He watched videos. He learned that the most important thing was the photograph. His heart sank. The house was dark, the walls a depressing shade of beige, the light dim. He looked at the beautiful cashmere coat. How could he make it look like treasure? He took the cleanest bedsheet they owned, a faded white one, and hung it over the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, creating a blank background. He took the heavy, brown leather handbag, the one that looked the most expensive, and hung it from a nail. He used his old, cracked cell phone to take a picture. He looked at the screen. The image was dark, blurry, and had a yellowish tint. It looked like a piece of evidence from a crime scene. "No," he said, his frustration rising. He tried again. He moved the kitchen lamp, taking off the lampshade so the bare bulb cast a harsh, bright light. He took another picture. Better. It was still ugly, but it was clear. He spent an hour writing the description. Brown leather handbag, very nice, good condition. He stared at it. It sounded pathetic. He went back to the websites. He looked at what other people wrote. They used words like luxurious, buttery soft leather, vintage, timeless. He tried again. Vintage brown leather handbag, unknown brand, but high-end. Heavy gold hardware, clean inside. He researched the price. He was astounded. Similar bags were selling for $300 or $400. He was terrified of asking too much and terrified of asking too little. He priced it at $150 plus shipping. His finger hovered over the list item button. He felt the same jolt of adrenaline he had felt at the auction. He was taking another gamble. He clicked it. He waited. The rest of the day was an agony of waiting. He checked the computer every 15 minutes. Nothing. He made lunch. He checked again. Nothing. He took Arrow for a walk in the rain, his bad leg aching, his mind convinced he was a fool. He came home, soaked, and sat at the table. Sydney was drawing. Arrow lay at his feet. The laptop was silent. Then it happened. A small electronic chime, a sound he had never heard the old laptop make before, issued from the speaker. An email. His heart stopped. He moved the cursor and clicked. The subject line read, "Congratulations, your item has sold." Thomas stared at it. $150. Someone, somewhere, had seen his blurry yellow picture and sent him $150. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound that was half sob. It was the first time he had laughed in months. It was not the $40,000. It was not the $38,500. It was $150, but it was his. He had earned it. This, he thought, was the real treasure. The sale changed everything. It unlocked the path forward. The next 2 weeks, a new routine was born. Thomas became a student of online commerce. He learned to find the brand names inside the purses. He learned to take photos in the brief, bright window of morning light that hit the porch. He found a tape measure and listed dimensions. He found boxes behind the grocery store. He bought a roll of packing tape, the squeal of it pulling from the roll becoming the new soundtrack of his life. The sales were not a flood. They were a trickle. A cashmere coat sold for $80, a pair of silk pants $40, another handbag $200. It was just enough. He used the money from the first sale to buy groceries. Not just canned soup and bread, but good groceries. He bought fresh milk and eggs for Sydney. He bought a whole chicken, which he roasted, filling the damp house with a scent of warmth and comfort. And he bought a large, expensive bag of high-quality dog food for Arrow. "You're up first, boy," Thomas said, filling the dog's bowl. "You earned it." He was still poor. He was still in the same damp house. But he was not desperate. He was a provider again. He was poor amidst riches. The irony was sharp. Every morning he would log on to his eBay account, hoping to see a $50 sale. And every night he would go to sleep on a bed that hid $38,500 in cash. The money he earned, he used. The money he hid, he guarded. The general's secret was his constant companion. The medals were in the duffel bag in his closet. The jewelry was in a sock drawer, a hard, lumpy secret. The journal was locked in his old toolbox. He was living two lives, the humble online seller of vintage clothes and the secret curator of a dead general's legacy. And the weight of both, in its own strange way, was the first thing in years that made him feel truly alive. The little online business created a fragile, new rhythm. Thomas's life began to follow a pattern. Wake before dawn, check the laptop for sales, get Sydney breakfast, and then spend the morning photographing and packing. He and the woman at the local post office were now on a first-name basis. The trickle of money was just that, a trickle. It was $80 one week, $120 the next. It was enough to buy groceries, to pay the electric bill, and to put $20 of gas in the truck. He was surviving. He was earning his way. But the house still held its secrets, and they were heavier than any rent payment. Every night he slept on the $3,500, and the guilt of that borrowed $1,500 was a constant, dull ache. But even heavier was the olive green duffel bag hidden in the back of his closet, the general's uniform, the silver star, the Purple Heart. This was not inventory. This was not something he could ever sell on eBay. He was a Marine. He knew what these things meant. They were not property. They were a man's soul, earned in service and sacrifice. And they were sitting in his closet next to his worn-out flannel shirts. It was a desecration. He could not, in good conscience, keep them. He could not sell them. And he could not, after listening to the general's tapes, even consider returning them to the children who had seen them only as inventory. He sat at the kitchen table one rainy afternoon, arrow's head on his foot. He looked at the old laptop. There was only one honorable solution. These items did not belong to him. They did not belong to Julian Grant. They belonged to history. He opened the laptop and typed, Military Museum, Astoria, Oregon. The first result was the Columbia Military History Museum. It was a small but respected institution located in an old armory downtown. He navigated to the staff page. He found a name, Dr. Camille Foster, curator. He spent 30 minutes writing and deleting, trying to find the words. He could not just walk in with a bag of medals. Dear Dr. Foster, I am a resident of Astoria. I am in possession of several military items, including a dress uniform, a silver star, and a Purple Heart. They belong to a high-ranking Army officer. I am seeking to donate them anonymously to a place where they will be respected. I believe they may be of historical significance. Sincerely, T. Cole. He hit send, his heart pounding. A reply came 2 days later. It was professional, cautious, and intrigued. Dr. Foster explained that the museum would be honored to evaluate the items, but that provenance, or the history of ownership, was very important. She asked if he would be willing to speak on the phone. He called her from his old cell phone, his voice rough. Dr. Foster, this is Thomas Cole. I sent you the email about the medals. Her voice was exactly as he had imagined, clear, intelligent, and kind. Mr. Cole, thank you for calling. You've certainly captured our attention. A silver star is a significant find. May I ask how you came to be in possession of these items? Thomas hesitated. I acquired them as part of an estate purchase. They were discarded, abandoned. I see. And the officer? Do you have a name? Thomas took a breath. General Harrison Grant. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. For a full 10 seconds, there was nothing. Mr. Cole, Dr. Foster said finally, her voice having lost all its academic calm. It was now sharp, focused, and serious. You are correct. This is extremely significant. General Grant was a prominent figure. I cannot simply accept these as an anonymous donation. There are legalities. His estate is still active, I believe. His family didn't want them, Thomas said, a sudden cold anger in his voice. He was afraid they would sell them. I understand your concern, she said, her tone gentle but firm. But to do this properly, to honor the general, I must contact the legal executor of his estate. That would be his son, Julian Grant. We must proceed by the book. May I have your address so we can discuss this in person? Thomas gave her his address, but when he hung up, the small sense of hope was gone. He was left with a cold dread. He had just invited the world he had been hiding from to his front door. 3 days passed. He heard nothing. He tried to focus on his small business. He sold a silk blouse for $30. It felt meaningless. He was in the muddy side yard on Friday afternoon, trying to use the money he'd earned to finally fix the brakes on his truck. He was covered in grease, his bad leg aching from kneeling on the cold, wet ground. Sydney was helping, sitting on the porch steps, handing him wrenches from his toolbox. Arrow was lying on the top step, his head up, watching the street. A car turned onto their road. Thomas didn't look up, assuming it was a neighbor, but the sound of the engine was wrong. It was not the rumble of an old truck or the whine of a commuter car. It was a low, powerful, expensive purr. The car stopped directly in front of his house. Thomas looked up from under the wheel well. It was a black Mercedes sedan, sleek and shining, looking utterly alien against the backdrop of his peeling paint and overgrown yard. Arrow stood up. A man emerged from the driver's side. He was in his late 50s, tall, and wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit that seemed immune to the damp Astoria air. His silver hair was perfectly cut. He radiated a cold, brittle, and impatient power. He was, Thomas knew instantly, the lawyer's son from the tapes. This was Julian Grant. Julian didn't look at the house. He looked at Thomas with an expression of pure disgust, as if he were examining an insect. He strode up the broken concrete path, his polished black shoes clicking. He did not knock. "Are you Thomas Cole?" Julian's voice was sharp, a weapon. Thomas slowly, painfully, pushed himself to his feet, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. His old flannel shirt felt pathetic in the face of the man's suit. "I am. Can I help you?" "I am Julian Grant," the man announced, as if presenting a credential. "Dr. Foster at the museum was kind enough to inform the estate that you are in possession of my father's property. You are holding stolen goods." "Stolen?" Thomas's voice was low, his own anger beginning to build. "I bought that unit, fair and square." "I don't care what you bought," Julian sneered, advancing to the porch. "You are a thief." He did not wait for a reply. He grabbed the handle of the screen door. Thomas stood in his way. "You're not invited," Thomas said. Julian shoved the screen door open anyway, the old hinges emitting a sharp metallic shriek. The door hit the wall with a hollow thud. "I am not asking." He stormed into the small living room. "I am a lawyer, Mr. Cole, and I am telling you to give me my father's belongings right now, or I will have the Astoria police here in 5 minutes and have you arrested for theft." The shouting, the violence of the entry, shattered the quiet of the small house. From the corner where she had been playing, Sydney let out a terrified, high-pitched wail. She dropped her broken ballerina. The sound of the porcelain hitting the bare wood floor was sharp, like a small gunshot. She ran, her small feet pounding, and hid behind Thomas's legs, her hands grabbing his greasy jeans, her body shaking with sobs. The child's cry was a trigger. Arrow, who had been on the porch, was inside in a single, fluid motion. He moved with a speed Thomas had never seen. He did not bark, he did not lunge, he simply planted himself. He stood directly between Julian Grant and the old man and his grandchild. He was a 90-pound wall of gray and white muscle. His head was low, his body was rigid, his ruff bristling. And then came the sound. It was not a bark. It was a low, deep, guttural sound that started in his chest and vibrated the air in the room. It was the sound of pure, controlled, and lethal menace. Arrow's lips curled back just enough to show his teeth. His dark, intelligent eyes were not looking at Julian's face. They were locked with absolute, terrifying focus on Julian's throat. The entire scene froze. Julian Grant, the arrogant, powerful lawyer, stopped breathing. He was a man who moved markets and intimidated judges. He was now being held hostage by a dog. "Call off your animal," Julian hissed, his voice losing its confident boom. Thomas did not move. He put one hand on Sydney's head, his own fear and confusion gone, replaced by a cold, familiar calm. It was the calm of 1973. It was the calm of the Marine. "He's not an animal," Thomas said, his voice quiet but carrying more weight than all of Julian's shouts. "He's just a good judge of character." He met Julian's gaze. "Now I think you should leave." "I am not leaving without my father's property," Julian said, though he did not move a single inch. "You came in here," Thomas said, his voice flat. "You threatened me. You terrified my granddaughter. You are not your father's son. You're just what he said you were on those tapes. Get out." The living room was frozen in a triangle of tension. Julian Grant, a man of immaculate power, stood neutralized. Sydney, a small, terrified child, whimpered behind her grandfather's leg. And Arrow, a 90-pound guardian, remained a statue of low, vibrating menace, his eyes locked on Julian's throat. Thomas Cole placed his large, grease-stained hand on the dog's head. The muscle under his palm was rigid, like coiled steel. "Arrow," Thomas said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Enough." The deep, threatening rumble in the dog's chest did not stop, but it subsided to a sound so low it was almost just a vibration. Arrow did not move, his gaze unwavering. "You will not get anywhere with me by shouting, Mr. Grant," Thomas said, his voice flat. He looked at the expensive suit, the angry, red-splotched face. "And you will not get past him, not while you're acting like a threat." Julian swallowed. His mask of legal authority had been torn away, leaving the raw, frustrated man beneath. He was a man who controlled boardrooms and courtrooms, and he was being held at bay by an old man and a dog. He tried to regain his composure, tugging at the lapels of his suit. This is preposterous," Julian hissed, his voice strained. "Sit down," Thomas commanded. He pointed to the single, wobbly chair at the kitchen table. "Sit down, and we will talk, if you can." Julian Grant looked at the chair, at Thomas, and at the dog. He made a calculation. He exhaled sharply and took the 2 steps to the chair, sitting stiffly, as if it were a throne. "Arrow," Thomas said. "Watch." The big dog took 2 steps back, planting himself beside Sydney, his body still a protective wall. The threat was no longer active, but it was a visible, silent promise. Julian pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his brow. He was a lawyer again. "This is very simple. You are in possession of my father's property. I demand you return it." "You keep using that word," Thomas said, his bad leg aching as he limped toward the kitchen counter. "Property? Is that what his silver star was? Property?" "He was a sick, confused old man," Julian snapped. "He was," Thomas agreed, his back to Julian. "And he was a soldier, and he was my general, and he was terrified of you. He knew you'd call his medals property. He knew you'd call his life inventory. He told me so himself." "You're lying." Thomas turned, holding the small black microcassette recorder from the leather satchel. Julian's eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps fear, passing over his face. Thomas did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He held the recorder in his large, steady hand and pressed the play button. The small kitchen filled with the sound of low electric hiss. And then the voice. It was thin, dry as paper, and weak. But it was unmistakably the voice of General Harrison Grant. "Julian came by today. He didn't come for a visit. He came with his briefcase. He says I'm confused. He thinks my mind is going. He and Caroline. They look at my things. They don't see my life. They see inventory. They see an auction price. He wants to protect my assets. He wants to protect them from me." Julian Grant sat frozen. The color drained from his face. This was not a stranger's accusation. This was his father's voice. A ghost returned, speaking a quiet, terrible truth from beyond the grave. The arrogance, the anger, the legal bluster, all of it evaporated, leaving only a stunned, pale man. Thomas pressed the stop button. The sudden silence was heavier and more damning than the voice had been. "There are 12 tapes," Thomas said quietly, "and his journal, and the silver box from the First Lady, the one he said you and Caroline didn't even know existed." Julian understood. The lawyer in him, the pragmatist, the man obsessed with reputation, instantly saw the chessboard. He was not in a poor man's house. He was in a minefield. This old man, this nobody, held the evidence that could irrevocably tarnish the Grant family name, evidence that would turn a celebrated general's legacy into a sordid story of elder abuse and greed. The threats were gone. The negotiation began. "What do you want, Mr. Cole?" Julian asked, his voice low, controlled, all the previous bluster gone. "What I wanted was to give his medals to Dr. Foster," Thomas said. "I wanted his honor to be respected, that's all." "My father's honor," Julian said, his words precise, "is a family matter. Those tapes are the private ramblings of a man who was unwell. They are not for public consumption. They belong to his estate." He reached down and opened his sleek black briefcase. He pulled out a checkbook. "You have preserved these items," Julian said, the words carefully chosen. He was building the legal narrative. "You have acted as a finder. You have incurred costs. You are entitled to a fee, a finder's and preservation fee." He took a gold pen from his jacket. He wrote quickly, decisively. He tore the check out and slid it across the wobbly table. Thomas looked down. The number was $100,000. $100,000, Julian said. "For your time, Mr. Cole, and for the items." He paused. "I also saw your granddaughter. My father was passionate about education. I will have my attorneys establish a private, fully funded trust for her education, whatever she needs." The offer hung in the air, a massive, life-changing weight. Then came the price. "In exchange," Julian said, his eyes hard and clear, "I want everything, the duffel, the medals, the silver box, the journal, and every single one of those tapes. And your silence. This conversation never happened. My father's legacy, as the world knows it, remains intact. Do we have a deal?" It was a bribe. It was a golden cage. It was a way out. Thomas looked down at Sydney. She had finally stopped crying and was just watching, her small face streaked with tears and dirt, her hand still clutching his jeans. He saw her future in that check. He saw a safe home, warm clothes, good food. He saw a life free from the suffocating damp of poverty, a life he could never give her by fixing brakes. He had to choose. He could be a righteous man and expose Julian, and in doing so, doom his granddaughter. Or he could be a grandfather. It was a pragmatic victory, one with a bitter compromise. "I accept the deal," Thomas said. He walked into his bedroom. Julian sat at the table, perfectly still. Thomas returned, not just with the leather satchel and the duffel bag of medals. He also carried the paper-wrapped bundles of cash from under his mattress. He placed the bags and the check on the table. Then he held out the $38,500. "This is also his," Thomas said. Julian stared at the money, utterly confused. "What is this?" "The $38,500 from the tin soldier. I borrowed $1,500 to stop the eviction. The rest is here." Julian looked at the cash, then at Thomas, and for the first time, his expression was not anger or calculation. It was pure, unadulterated shock. He had come prepared to buy out a greedy scavenger. He had not come prepared to face a man of honor. Thomas, the poor, grease-stained veteran, was handing back a fortune after already accepting the check. Julian had no words. He slowly, almost reverently, took the cash. He packed the money, the tapes, the journal, and the medals into his briefcase and another bag. He stood up. "You will not hear from me again," he said. It was not a threat. It was a statement. He walked out the door. The sound of the Mercedes engine starting was a low, distant purr, and then he was gone. Thomas stood in the empty room, the $100,000 check in his hand. He sank into the chair, his bad leg giving out, and covered his face. A few days later, the house was the same, but everything was different. The check was in the bank. The fear was gone. They were safe. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, watching Sydney draw. Arrow was asleep at his feet, his breathing a low, peaceful rumble. "I have something for you, Pumpkin," Thomas said. He held out his hand. In his palm was the porcelain ballerina music box. He had taken it to a small shop on the edge of town, Petrov's Clock and Repair. He had given the owner, Mr. Petrov, a quiet man with silver glasses and skilled, steady hands, $50 from his own pocket to fix it. Sydney's eyes went wide. She took the box, her expression cautious, as if afraid to hope. Thomas smiled, his weathered face softening. "Go on. Wind it?" She fumbled with the small key. He helped her, his large, rough thumb guiding her small fingers. He turned the key. A small, mechanical whirring sound came from the box. And then, for the first time, a clear, tiny melody began to play. It was a high, plinking, crystalline tune, fragile and beautiful, filling the small, damp kitchen with a sound that was not rain, was not shouting, was not failure. It was hope. Sydney gasped, her mouth forming a perfect O. Her eyes, which had been so old and watchful, were suddenly just the eyes of a 4-year-old child. A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. The story of Thomas and Arrow reminds us that even when life feels broken, like a silent music box, the loyalty of a true friend and the love of family can find a way to repair the melody. These bonds are the real treasure hidden in plain sight. If these tales of courage and devotion bring warmth to your heart, we hope you'll consider becoming part of our story family by subscribing. We truly love reading your own reflections on what loyalty means to you in the comments. The journey doesn't have to end here. Another story is waiting for you right on the screen.